Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to finish up the last of the notes for Chapter 11. You'll have a test over Chapter 11 tomorrow. If you have not already looked through the other video that I've posted about the AP test, the AP test this year will be entirely extended response. So the way they are going to be asking the questions is in a way that is not really, as they describe it, Googleable. So basically, it's application type things where you have to be able to apply different concepts. So that's the way the tests are going to be in here for the next couple chapters, is we're going to basically take concepts from this chapter and make you be able to apply those. So tomorrow you'll have your test over Chapter 11. It will be 2 extended response questions. One will be specific to your interest group. The other one will be more broad. And again, you can use notes, anything like that, but it's going to be really application-based to make sure that you understand the concepts from this chapter. Also, in that other video, it talked about the fact that the AP test will be shortened a little bit. On Wednesday, when we go through the video in here, I will go over the specific things that will be on the test and what won't be on the test. We don't know the format yet in terms of which of the types of extended response questions they're going to ask you. They said that they would have that information out by April the 3rd. So hopefully when that comes out, I'll be able to pass that information along to you without any trouble there. Okay, today we're going to finish up the last little bit of notes for Chapter 11. We talked on Friday about interest groups and the impact that they had on the banking industry, particularly as it relates to the Glass-Steagall Act and the Dodd-Frank Act, those pieces of legislation that were designed to regulate banks. So today I want to talk about a little bit about how interest groups operate in terms of the public. One of the biggest things that we see, particularly in a media-driven society, is that the ability to generate a headline is significant. So oftentimes, interest groups, if they're not able to lobby politicians, aren't able to get politicians to do what they want, they will oftentimes turn to the media. So again, the media being one of these linkage institutions that kind of links people to their government, interest groups are able to turn to those linkage institutions and really get information out that way, sometimes to embarrass or to force politicians to act based upon their willingness or unwillingness to address certain issues that are important to that interest group. So oftentimes the fact that you can get the media to pay attention to something is as important as anything else. So politicians also rely on interest groups for information. So in addition to getting information out to the public, politicians oftentimes will turn to interest groups when they need information about a topic. If you look at coronavirus right now, the government does not know everything about this topic. So they're going to be turning to the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association for information. And those interest groups will provide them with good information because they want the government to come to them in the future about those topics. So one of the things that's really critical that interest groups play a role in is keeping the government informed on issues that matter. And this would be a great example of that as to what's happening right now. So interest groups play that information role, whether it be directly to government or to us if government can't do or won't do what they want them to do. Now, one thing that interest groups also pay attention to are ratings that they give to politicians. And when you did your senator earlier this year, when you researched your senator, I had you look up how that senator was rated by various interest groups. And most interest groups, I won't say all, but most interest groups do provide ratings to senators. And sometimes senators wear that as a badge of honor. So some senators will promote the fact that they're rated an A+ by the NRA. Other senators promote the fact that they're rated an F by the NRA. They take pride in the fact that they are proposing gun control legislation that the NRA doesn't like. So sometimes getting an F rating doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing to a politician. It's a bad thing from the perspective of that interest group, but sometimes politicians will use that to kind of play up their what they feel about a certain issue. Now, we also hear the term political cues. And this is something that politicians oftentimes will turn to interest groups, particularly on issues where they want to see what an interest group thinks about a certain topic. So let's say I don't know how to vote on a certain issue, and I'm a Democrat. I might turn to the unions who support me. I might turn to the NAACP who supports me and see what they think about this issue. And that might sometimes influence how I vote. So sometimes the parties will turn to certain groups. The Chamber of Commerce provides funding to a lot of Republican members of Congress. They will oftentimes turn to the chamber to see how they feel about certain issues. The NRA, they'll turn to the NRA. So when you have these interest groups that are very much giving money to one party over the other. Oftentimes those parties will pay attention to what those interest groups want and take what we call a political cue from those interest groups, and will act in their interest because they're obviously providing them with funding and they want to keep that funding going. So oftentimes you have a lot of these interest groups, and some of them we've heard of. Obviously the NRA, pro-gun, tends to be pro-conservative. AFL-CIO is pro-labor, tends to be pro-Democrats or liberals. So these are things that, again, these ratings and how the political cues these organizations provide are significant to many politicians. Now, one of the things that these interest groups do is that they try to get information out to politicians as quickly as humanly possible. Now, obviously today in the era of text messaging and things like that, that's very easy to do. But we still have in a lot of these offices of interest groups as well as legislatures, we have these banks of fax machines where if somebody's got a floor vote, they can get a fax, something sent to them on paper very, very quickly that they can get out to somebody really quickly. So obviously email has replaced that in a large sense, but we still have those fax machines that are still used, some of this older technology to be able to get information out to politicians, particularly at times when you're not allowed to have certain things on the floor. During Trump's impeachment, there was a rule in the Senate is that you couldn't have electronic devices on the floor. So I couldn't text somebody information. I needed to get information to them in some other way. So fax machines, emails that are printed out, things like that are oftentimes the way that interest groups get that information out. Now, revisiting a topic we talked about earlier this year, earmarks are something that interest groups pay a lot of attention to. So we talked about earmarks in the context of pork barrel legislation and different things like that. Earmarks are specific provisions that get tacked on to bills or specific directions as to how money is spent on a certain topic. So let's say I have a bill that's about transportation, and I might tack an earmark onto that to benefit the NRA, or I might tack an earmark onto that to benefit the Chamber of Commerce if they have influence with those legislators. So lobbyists, the information that they're able to provide to members of Congress is significant, and those lobbyists are oftentimes able to get things tacked onto bills. Now, that became much more prevalent in the 1970s when we saw some of our campaign finance things come down, particularly with the Buckley versus Vallejo case, which allowed for these political action committees to exist and to provide money to legislators in terms of campaign donations. Once that happened, the number of earmarks and bills skyrocketed. So they've always existed, but they really took off in the 1970s once we made it easier for those types of things to get tacked onto bills. Now, one of the things that the book talks a lot about, and it's obviously some old data, but in 2008, there were over 11,000 earmarks that were tacked onto bills. So these are things that were unrelated to the thing that was being discussed in that bill, and those earmarks totaled $16 billion. So if you look at our budget deficit that we tried to address at the very beginning of the year, these are things that could obviously be cut that are unrelated to a bill. Now the question then becomes, are these good earmarks or bad earmarks? And the question, it really comes down to, who are you and what side are you on? So if I'm someone who is pro-business, I might think that an earmark that the Chamber of Commerce got tacked onto a transportation bill is great. If I'm pro-gun, I might think that an earmark that the NRA got tacked onto a bill is great. If I'm against those issues, I might think that it's bad. So even though it's unrelated, doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad if it's addressing something that is of relevance to a certain topic. I know Rand Paul, when he was discussing the bailout bill that's happening right now in Congress as to what's going to happen with our coronavirus bailout, is that Rand Paul was pushing for removal of troops from Afghanistan as something that he wanted on that bill. Now that's something that's tacked onto the bill that's completely unrelated to the topic. That's not an earmark because it's not the spending of money, but you can see how he might have been pushed by different interest groups to do that, and that would be something that he responded appropriately. Now, obviously, if you didn't hear, Rand Paul also tested positive for coronavirus today, so that's something that we're still kind of looking to see how that's going to play out. He interacted with a lot of members of the Senate over the last couple of days, so I would not be shocked if other members of the Senate were to test positive as well in the next couple of days. So we'll kind of keep our eye on that as to see what happens there. But again, the book talks a lot about the rise of what we call new politics today. And new politics today means that not only are members of Congress representing us, but they're representing all of these other interests. And interest groups through political action committees and lobbyists play a huge role in how that works, and the information that gets out there. So the book talks a lot about the fact that interest groups today play what we call an outsider strategy, and that they kind of play to this idea of, we can get information out to you quickly if you're a member of Congress, and allows you to address things from the perspective of, I'm not part of the DC establishment. Most members of Congress try to play up the fact that they're not part of the problem in Washington, DC, because they know that everybody hates Congress. If I'm kind of playing this outsider strategy, I can appeal to local issues that interest groups may care about, or things that are less specific to the DC establishment. So when they talk about the outsider strategy, they're kind of playing to this individualistic nature of Congress and the media, is that I want to get information out to the community. I want to get it out immediately. And interest groups can help me do that, whether that's something that's good or bad. Interest groups, because they have the ear of the media, can get information out pretty quickly. Interest groups also kind of play the role of what we call grassroots lobbying, in that they can put pressure on Congress to act. Back in the 1980s, we had a thing with saccharin, which was something that we used to use in Diet Coke. And we found that out, that it was cancer causing, and that Coke continued to put this in there. The FDA continued to approve it for use in Coke, until a lot of our interest groups started to push back on that and say that this is a bad idea, and that their push through the media got Coke to change the ingredients in Diet Coke and remove that from their from the drinks. And they only did that because Congress banned it, and it was because interest groups put pressure on the FDA, put pressure on Congress to actually do that. So the interest groups had a really important lobbying message outside of just what they would normally do in terms of lobbying Congress, is that they lobbied the media to make an impact on Congress because they felt pressure to act there. Obviously, modern technology changes that, makes things a lot easier for the media to get things out than they would have had before. So let's kind of skip through that slide there. Now, just to kind of briefly revisit this idea of political action committees, and I know we've talked about this a couple times, but I want to kind of just revisit this very briefly. 1970s was when things changed. Political action committees were legalized in the 1970s, and they allowed interest groups, businesses, other things like that, to create these political action committees to give money to members of Congress. Now, remember, we have PACs and super PACs, and a political action committee, or a PAC, can take in limited amounts of money. There are campaign donation limits on PACs. Super PACs have unlimited amounts of money that they can take in, but they cannot coordinate with any specific candidate. So a super PAC cannot have any level of coordination. If they do, they're breaking campaign finance laws. Now, today we have all sorts of members of Congress who have political action committees. These are called leadership PACs. I know Nancy Pelosi has one. Mitch McConnell has one. These are all PACs that are designed to raise money for other candidates in Congress. So if I'm Nancy Pelosi, I can take in money from this political action committee, and I can donate that to any Democrat who's running in the House or the Senate. And I have these spending limits, but by having this political action committee, I can divvy up money to a lot of different people over time. So that has significantly changed the way that things run, in terms of how campaigns are run, in terms of money that's donated. Now, today there's more than 4,500 political action committees, and there are limits. So when you look at political action committees, now again, we're talking about PACs and not super PACs. Any PAC can give $5,000 to any federal candidate, $15,000 to a political party, and $5,000 to a state and local party. So let's say I'm Nancy Pelosi and I start a political action committee. My PAC can give $5,000 to every single Democratic candidate. So that's $5,000 times 435 House seats, 100 Senate seats. I can then give $15,000 to the National Democratic Party, and I can give $5,000 to every state Democratic Party and any local Democratic Party. So if I'm the Montgomery County Democrats, I can get money from her PAC. So you can see that political action committee started by one person could spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on campaigns through the amount of money that she's able to give. Now, if she has a PAC and then other Democrats in the House have PACs, they can do the exact same thing, and they can give all this money to different people. So political action committees allow us to give money to lots and lots and lots of different people, which just blows up the amount of money that we have in politics. So when we look at PACs, they can be formed by businesses, they can be formed by unions, trade organizations, any sort of member of Congress, ideological organizations, which are interest groups. Those are all groups that can form political action committees, and because of that, that just significantly changes the amount of money that we have in Congress. Now, again, the book talks about with so many PACs, there's money for everybody, and Citizens United was the case that really addressed this. So PACs were recognized as free speech. So when the provision of Citizens United that looked at business and union spending on ads, because that was upheld, that was struck down from McCain-Feingold. McCain-Feingold tried to say that they couldn't spend money on ads, and Citizens United struck that down. That really upheld the ability of PACs to exist and really strengthened the ability of government to do this. So again, we've talked about this case repeatedly. I'm not going to spend any more time on it, but I want to just kind of talk about the fact that PACs, by being upheld, changed the nature of government and changed the nature of the amount of money that we had in there. Now, last thing for this chapter I want to talk about is what's called the Ethics in Government Act. And the Ethics in Government Act was passed in 1978 to put some restrictions on the executive branch in terms of what they could and couldn't do as it relates to taking in money and having to disclose things. So if I'm a member of the executive branch today, according to the Ethics in Government Act, I have to disclose all sources of my income, including my spouse. Now, this is part of the reason that Trump's tax returns were such a big deal in the 2016 election, is that he has never disclosed those publicly, so he is technically in violation of the Ethics in Government Act. In that he's never disclosed those. Now, his excuse is, well, the IRS has them, so somebody in government has access to those. But he's technically in violation of this law. But because enforcement of this law comes from the executive branch, he can't really, he would have to force himself to comply with it, which he obviously hasn't done. But all sources of income must be specified, and that's to make sure that no member of the executive branch is taking money from an interest group or any outside organization that might influence how they act. They must also disclose any positions in other organizations or resign those positions. President Trump had to renounce any sort of seats he had on boards when he was elected president. He had to step aside from running his companies because his companies are international. Now, obviously, his sons and daughters still run those companies, so obviously there's kind of a close nexus there between the two of them, but he had to step aside there. After leaving office, any member of the executive branch cannot represent anyone before their old agency. So let's say I'm the director of Housing and Urban Development, and then I leave office. I cannot represent an agency or an interest group as a lobbyist before the Department of Housing and Urban Development for a period of time. And that period is 2 years that I can't really address anyone related to my old job. And there have been a lot of examples of people who have kind of broken this rule, who've gotten in trouble for that. So during the Bush administration, the former the Secretary of Homeland Security was a guy by the name of Michael Chertoff, and when he was when he was Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, he was really pushing for full body scanners in every single American airport, and that was something that he was really trying to push. Now, that never fully happened. There's some smaller airports that still don't have them, but he was really pushing for that. We found out later, once he was out of government, that he had lobbied for a firm that made those body scanners. So that was something that was a big conflict of interest in terms of his ability to kind of push for those when he was potentially profiting off of those. And what really contributes to this, and the book talks about what we call the revolving door. And this is the big thing I want you to really pay attention to here, is that we have a lot of people in politics who come and go. Excuse me. When Democrats leave office, people who work in these government agencies leave, and when Democrats come back into office, they come back. And during the time that they're not in government, they oftentimes work for the private sector. They work for some of these interest groups. They work for some companies that have lobbyists, and they have a lot of influence on how government works. So the revolving door really contributes to a lot of people who may have ethical conundrums when it comes to how they act in government. And a lot of people are lobbying for things that they benefit from. And when they get into government positions, they can benefit from some of the things that they are lobbying for, some of the organizations that they work for. Nowhere is that more true than the FDA. The FDA oftentimes employs people who are responsible for approving certain drugs who worked for the drug companies that were producing those drugs. And that is a big potential ethical violation if they're approving things that may not work because they have some sort of financial benefit from that. So that is a significant piece of how interest groups work. All right, that is it for Chapter 11 notes. Your writing prompt for today, I want you to explain to me the Glass-Steagall Act, what it did to regulate banks, why it changed, why that act went away, and what the Dodd-Frank Act was that replaced it. So we talked about that on Friday. You can also look any of that information up in the book or online. So Glass-Steagall Act and Dodd-Frank Act, what were they? How did they change the way that we regulate banks? Tomorrow, look online. You'll have your Chapter 11 test. You must turn that in before 11:59 tomorrow night. If you have any questions, please email me. Hope everybody has